The air in the courtroom thickened as I watched Judge Anderson's expression change. His eyes widened slightly as he reviewed the evidence photos, each one more damning than the last. The Mason family sat across the aisle, their faces masks of righteous indignation slowly crumbling into horror. "My determination," the judge announced, his voice cutting through the silence, "is that this case will proceed to criminal trial with all evidence admissible." Eleanor Mason's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth, her husband Robert's face drained of color, and their son Michael, the man I once loved, couldn't even look at me. They had called me crazy, unstable, delusional. Now they would face justice for what lay hidden beneath their floorboards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Vanessa Calloway. I'm 34 years old and a forensic accountant. This is the story of how I discovered the truth behind my boyfriend's perfect family, survived their attempts to silence me, and brought justice to 8 forgotten victims. I first met Michael Mason at a charity gala 3 years ago. He was charming, intelligent, and came from one of the most respected families in Oak Ridge. The Masons had deep roots in our community. Robert ran the town's largest real estate company. Eleanor headed numerous charity boards, and they lived in a stunning Victorian mansion that had been in their family for generations. Michael had followed in his father's footsteps, working as the company's financial director. When he asked for my number that night, I never imagined I was stepping into a nightmare that would consume the next 3 years of my life. Our relationship progressed quickly. Michael was attentive, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in my work analyzing financial records for fraud investigations. 6 months after we started dating, he invited me to Sunday dinner at the Mason family home, a weekly tradition he described as sacred to his parents. I remember standing at their ornate front door, smoothing down my dress, nervous about making a good impression. The Mason estate was even more impressive up close. 3 stories of historic architecture surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. Eleanor greeted me with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Robert's handshake was firm, his assessment of me barely concealed as his gaze swept from my simple dress to my sensible shoes. The dinner was formal, with heavy sterling silverware and conversations that felt like carefully scripted performances. "So, Vanessa," Robert said as the housekeeper served the main course, "Michael tells us you work with numbers. Bookkeeping, is it?" "Forensic accounting, actually," I corrected gently. "I analyze financial records for inconsistencies, usually for legal cases or fraud investigations." Eleanor's smile tightened. "How fascinating. Searching for other people's mistakes. That must be fulfilling." I noticed how Michael tensed beside me, how he quickly steered the conversation toward safer topics. It was the first red flag, one I should have heeded. But I was already falling in love with him, already making excuses for his family's cold reception. Over the next few months, I spent more time at the Mason home. Michael lived in the carriage house on the property, converted into a modern apartment, but most family activities happened in the main house. I began to notice peculiarities. Rooms that remained perpetually locked, uncomfortable silences when certain topics arose, and the basement door that was always secured with not 1 but 3 separate locks. "Old houses have hazards," Eleanor explained when she caught me looking at the basement door. "The foundation is unstable. We keep it locked for safety." But it was more than just locked doors that unsettled me. It was the way the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, would fall silent whenever Robert entered a room. It was how the gardener never maintained the back section of the property, despite its overgrown state. It was the strange sounds I sometimes heard late at night when staying at Michael's, faint and distant, like someone moving furniture below ground. "It's just the house settling," Michael assured me. "These old Victorians, they make all kinds of noises." Then came the accounting discrepancies. Michael had asked me to help organize some paperwork for his personal taxes, and I noticed several large transfers from the family company to offshore accounts. When I asked about them casually, his reaction was anything but casual. "Those are private family matters," he snapped, gathering the papers quickly. "I shouldn't have involved you in this." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. While Michael slept, I copied some of the financial documents he had hastily hidden away. It wasn't just the transfers that bothered me, it was the pattern. Every few years, large sums of money moved through a series of shell companies before disappearing entirely. And each time, the dates corresponded with something else I had noticed in newspaper archives, missing persons cases in Oak Ridge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My professional instincts were screaming at me, but my heart argued for trust, for belief in the man I loved. The internal conflict kept me awake night after night as I discreetly investigated further. I cross-referenced the financial transactions with local news reports, property records, and even historical society documents about the Mason estate. A pattern emerged that chilled me to the bone. Every major renovation of the mansion coincided with both a financial transfer and a disappearance. "You're working too hard," Michael commented one evening, finding me surrounded by papers in my apartment. "These cases you're handling are making you paranoid." I smiled and agreed, hiding my real research under legitimate work files. Part of me wanted to be wrong, to discover an innocent explanation for everything. But the deeper I dug, the more disturbing the connections became. The most recent disappearance had been a contractor hired to do some work on the Mason home, a man who allegedly skipped town after being paid in advance. His family insisted he would never abandon his children, but the police investigation went nowhere. I began finding excuses to explore the Mason home when visiting. I memorized the layout, noted which areas seemed off-limits, and paid attention to the thickness of walls and floors. During one dinner, I deliberately dropped my napkin near the basement door and noticed scratch marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly across the hardwood. "Vanessa, are you feeling well?" Eleanor asked at another family dinner, her voice honeyed with false concern. "You seem distracted lately. Michael mentioned you've been working unusual hours." "I'm fine," I assured her, "just busy with a complex case." "What kind of case?" Robert inquired, his interest seemingly casual. "Oh, the usual. Following money trails, looking for inconsistencies." Sometimes the smallest financial detail can unravel years of deception. The look that passed between Robert and Eleanor was brief, but unmistakable. That night, Michael and I had our first serious argument. "My parents think you're behaving strangely," he said. "They're worried about you, about us." "Why would they be worried?" I asked. "Because I'm asking questions? Because I notice things?" "What's that supposed to mean?" His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Nothing." I backpedaled, suddenly aware of a danger I couldn't quite name. "I'm just stressed from work." 2 days later, my apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, just my laptop and some files. The police called it a random burglary, but I knew better. I began backing up my research to secure cloud storage and kept physical copies at my office. I also installed a small security camera in my apartment, hidden inside a bookshelf. When I reviewed the footage a week later, I felt the blood drain from my face. While I was at work, Michael had entered my apartment using his key. He spent nearly an hour searching through my belongings, paying special attention to my home office and filing cabinets. He found nothing. I had moved everything important, but the betrayal cut deep. That evening, instead of confronting him, I pretended everything was normal. We had dinner, watched a movie, and when he suggested staying the night, I agreed. But as he slept beside me, I lay awake, planning my next move. I needed concrete evidence before going to the authorities. Suspicions and financial irregularities wouldn't be enough to convince anyone to investigate the respected Mason family. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, when the Masons hosted their annual garden party. With everyone occupied outdoors, I slipped away to use the restroom, and instead made my way to the basement door. The 3 locks presented a challenge I'd prepared for, lock-picking skills acquired through a security course for my profession. My hands trembled as I worked, aware that discovery would be catastrophic. The 3rd lock finally yielded, and I eased the heavy door open. The smell hit me first: damp earth, chemicals, and something else. Something that triggered a primal fear response. The stairs descended into darkness, but I had come prepared with a small flashlight. Each step downward seemed to take me further from the rational world I knew, into something twisted and wrong. The basement was larger than I expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. Parts had been recently renovated, with new concrete poured and fresh paint on the walls. But it was the far section that drew my attention, an area hidden behind a false wall that didn't quite match the rest of the construction. My flashlight beam revealed drag marks on the floor leading directly to it. Heart-pounding, I examined the wall and found the concealed mechanism that released it. Beyond lay a small room with a dirt floor. At first, it appeared empty, disappointing after the risk I'd taken. Then my light caught something partially buried in the corner, the edge of what looked like fabric. I moved closer, knelt down, and brushed away some of the loose soil. A hand. A human hand, partially decomposed but unmistakable. I stifled a scream and scrambled backward, dropping my flashlight in panic. As I fumbled to retrieve it, the beam swept across more disturbed earth in various parts of the room. Multiple burial sites. I had found them, all the missing people, hidden beneath the Mason family home. I fled, barely remembering to lock the basement door behind me. Somehow, I maintained composure through the remainder of the party, though I couldn't look Michael in the eye. I excused myself early, claiming a migraine, and drove straight to the police station. There, I hit the first wall of disbelief. "Miss Calloway, these are extremely serious allegations," Detective Rivera said after listening to my breathless account. "The Masons are pillars of this community." "I know what I saw," I insisted. "Check the missing persons reports. Look at the financial records I've brought you. There's a pattern. We can't obtain a search warrant based on your unauthorized entry into a private area of their home. That's breaking and entering, which is itself a crime." I left the station frustrated but not defeated. If the local police wouldn't help, I would find someone who would. I contacted the FBI field office in the neighboring city and spent 3 hours detailing everything to a special agent who specialized in serial murder cases. He seemed more receptive but warned me that building a case would take time, and that I should be careful. "If what you're suggesting is true," Agent Townsend said, "then you've put yourself in extreme danger. These people have maintained this secret for years. They won't hesitate to eliminate a threat." That night, I packed essentials and checked into a hotel under a false name. I didn't trust my apartment anymore, and I couldn't risk being found until authorities took action. I was right to be cautious. The next morning, Michael called, his voice strained. "Where are you? I came by your place and you weren't there. Your neighbor said you left with a suitcase." "I needed some space," I said, trying to sound normal. "Work stress. I'm just taking a few days to clear my head." "At least tell me where you are. I'm worried about you, Vanessa. My parents are concerned too. They think you've been acting unstable." The word choice sent a chill through me. They were already setting the stage, establishing a narrative of mental instability that would discredit anything I might say against them. "I'm fine, Michael. I'll call you in a few days." Over the next week, the campaign against me intensified. My boss called to discuss concerns about my work, concerns raised by an anonymous source questioning my mental health. Former colleagues received inquiries about my, quote, erratic behavior. My own mother called after Robert Mason personally visited her, expressing worry about my paranoid delusions regarding his family. "He seemed so sincere, honey," Mom said. "He said you've been making wild accusations, that you might need professional help." "Mom, they're trying to discredit me because I know what they've done," I told her, fighting tears. "Please, trust me on this." But doubt had been planted, and I could hear it in her voice. The Masons were methodically isolating me, cutting off my support systems, making me appear unhinged. It was working. Even Agent Townsend seemed to be pulling back, his calls becoming less frequent as the whispers about my mental state spread. I was being erased. My credibility, my professional reputation, my relationships, all systematically dismantled by a family with generations of practice at making problems disappear. But they had underestimated one thing: my determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. 2 weeks into my self-imposed exile, I received an unexpected ally. Mrs. Winters, the Masons' housekeeper of 30 years, contacted me through a carefully anonymous email. "I believe you," her message read. "I've suspected for years, but was too afraid to speak. I have proof. Photos of Robert and his father before him, moving things into that basement at night. Records I've kept. Meet me tomorrow." We arranged to meet at a busy shopping center 2 towns over. I arrived early, positioning myself where I could observe all approaches. Mrs. Winters appeared exactly on time, her usually immaculate uniform replaced by nondescript civilian clothes. She looked older, more fragile away from the Mason estate. "I should have done this years ago," she said, handing me a sealed envelope. "But they know everything about me, where my children live, my grandchildren. They made it clear what would happen if I ever spoke out." "Why now?" I asked. "Because you're brave enough to stand up to them, and because I can't take another ghost to my grave." She squeezed my hand. "Be careful, Miss Calloway. The family has resources you can't imagine, and friends in places that should frighten you." The envelope contained decades of dated entries, photographs, and small items. A watch, an earring, a torn piece of identification, all belonging to people who had disappeared. Mrs. Winters had documented her suspicions meticulously, hiding the evidence in a safe deposit box her employers knew nothing about. Armed with this new evidence, I reached out to Agent Townsend again. This time, his response was immediate. We met at the FBI field office, where I presented everything: my financial analysis, Mrs. Winters, documentation, and my own observations. 4 hours later, a federal judge signed a search warrant for the Mason estate. The raid happened at dawn. I watched from Agent Townsend's car as federal agents surrounded the property. Robert and Eleanor were led out in handcuffs, still in their night clothes, faces twisted with rage and disbelief. Michael came later, ashen and silent. The basement excavation began that afternoon and continued for 3 days. 8 bodies were recovered. 8 people who had crossed paths with the Mason family and paid with their lives. The oldest remains dated back nearly 50 years, victims of not just Robert but his father before him. A family tradition of murder, passed down through generations like a treasured heirloom. The preliminary hearing was a media circus. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as the Mason family was escorted inside, no longer in designer clothes but orange jumpsuits that rendered them ordinary, human, fallible. I sat in the back row, watching as their expensive legal team tried to paint me as an obsessed, unstable woman seeking revenge for a failed relationship. The prosecution had me take the stand on the second day, and I felt every eye in the courtroom boring into me as I recounted my suspicions, discoveries, and the horror of that basement room. "Miss Calloway," the defense attorney said, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you were upset when Michael Mason began distancing himself from you? That you created this elaborate conspiracy theory as retaliation?" "No," I said firmly. "I loved Michael. I wanted to be wrong. Every step of my investigation I prayed I was mistaken. Yet you broke into the Mason home, trespassed in a restricted area, and disturbed private property. These aren't the actions of a rational person." I leaned forward slightly. "When you suspect someone has murdered multiple people and buried them under their house, you don't exactly knock on the front door and ask to see the bodies." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the courtroom. The defense attorney's face hardened. He tried another approach. "Your own mother expressed concerns about your mental health, didn't she? After Mr. Robert Mason kindly reached out to her?" "My mother was manipulated by a man who has apparently been manipulating this entire community for decades," I replied. "The same man who tried to destroy my reputation when he realized I was getting too close to his family's secrets." Mrs. Winters testified next, her voice quavering but determined as she described years of suspicious activities, strange sounds, and the Masons' obsessive protection of their basement. Other witnesses followed: former employees, neighbors who had noticed odd patterns, family members of the victims who spoke of their loved ones, connections to the Mason estate before disappearing. The most damning testimony came from the forensic teams. 8 victims, buried over 50 years, all showing similar methods of death. DNA evidence linking Robert Mason to 3 of the more recent bodies. Financial records connecting payments to cover-ups. And finally, the results of the expanded search. 2 additional bodies found on a rural property owned by a Mason family shell corporation. When the judge ruled that the case would proceed to criminal trial with all evidence admissible, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The Masons' facade had finally crumbled, exposing the rot beneath generations of wealth and privilege. As I left the courthouse, a young reporter caught up with me. "Ms. Calloway, how does it feel to be vindicated after everyone called you crazy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I paused, considering her question. Vindication isn't what matters here. 10 people lost their lives. 10 families spent years wondering what happened to someone they loved. If my actions help bring them closure, that's what matters. The months between the preliminary hearing and the trial were surreal. I became recognizable in town, the woman who had exposed the Masons. Some people expressed admiration. Others couldn't hide their disbelief that a family so respected could harbor such darkness. A few, those whose livelihoods had been connected to the Mason empire, regarded me with undisguised hostility. I returned to work, though my role changed. My firm recognized the value of my investigative skills and moved me to a specialized division handling complex fraud cases. The irony wasn't lost on me. My professional life was flourishing because I had uncovered a horror most people couldn't imagine. My personal life was more complicated. Friends who had distanced themselves during the Masons' smear campaign now wanted to reconnect. Dating seemed impossible. How do you casually mention over dinner that your last relationship ended when you discovered your boyfriend's family had been murdering people for generations? And always, there was the knowledge that 3 of the most dangerous people I'd ever encountered blamed me for their downfall. Eleanor Mason was the first to break. 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, she offered to testify against her husband and son in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecution approached me about the deal. She claims she was coerced. District Attorney Jensen explained that she feared for her life if she ever spoke out against the family tradition. "Do you believe her?" I asked. Frankly, no. But her testimony would strengthen our case against Robert and Michael. We'd ensure she still serves significant time. I thought about Eleanor's perfectly composed face as she had systematically worked to destroy my credibility. The calculated ways she had insinuated concerns about my mental health to anyone who would listen. The decades she had lived in that house, surely aware of what happened in the basement. "She's lying," I said finally. "The evidence shows she was an active participant, not a victim. The financial records indicate she managed the offshore accounts where they hid the money stolen from victims. If you offer her a deal, you're sending a message that wealth and privilege still count for something, even in a case like this." The DA studied me for a moment. "You understand if she doesn't testify, there's a slightly higher risk Robert or Michael might escape the most serious charges?" "I understand probability better than most, Mr. Jensen. But I also understand justice. Eleanor Mason is as guilty as her husband and son." The prosecution declined Eleanor's offer. When the news broke, I received an anonymous bouquet of black roses with a card that read simply, "You'll regret this." I handed the flowers and card to Agent Townsend, who arranged for additional security at my apartment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trial began on a rainy Tuesday in October, almost a year after I had first discovered the bodies. I attended every day, listening as the prosecution methodically presented the case against the Mason family. Forensic experts detailed how the victims had died, all strangled, all showing signs of being held captive before death. Financial investigators explained how the Masons had stolen identities and assets from their victims, using the proceeds to expand their wealth. Robert Mason maintained the imperious demeanor that had once commanded respect, now reading as cold indifference to human suffering. Eleanor's carefully cultivated charm had hardened into brittle resentment. Michael was the only one who showed any emotion, occasionally glancing in my direction with an expression I couldn't decipher. Was it regret, hatred, or something else entirely? I was called to testify again during the second week. This time the questions were more detailed, more invasive. The defense team had clearly decided their best strategy was to destroy me personally. "Ms. Calloway," Michael's attorney began, "would you describe yourself as someone who becomes obsessed with patterns and details?" "I'm detail-oriented," I replied carefully. "It's an asset in my profession." "So detail-oriented that you couldn't accept the end of your relationship with Michael Mason? So fixated that you invented connections where none existed?" "The connections I discovered weren't invented. They're supported by financial records, forensic evidence, and witness testimony. But you were the one who set this entire process in motion, based on your unauthorized snooping. Isn't it possible that your emotional involvement clouded your judgment?" I took a deep breath. When I found financial irregularities in the Mason records, I wasn't acting as Michael's girlfriend. I was acting as a forensic accountant who recognized signs of criminal activity. When I discovered human remains in their basement, I wasn't a scorned lover seeking revenge. I was a citizen reporting a crime. The attorney changed tactics, bringing up details from my past. A college boyfriend who had filed a restraining order after our breakup, later dismissed when his claims proved false. Therapy sessions I had attended after my father's death. Medication I had briefly taken for anxiety. Objection, the prosecutor called. Relevance? I'm establishing the witness's history of emotional instability and relationship difficulties, Your Honor, the defense attorney replied smoothly. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, the judge warned. For 3 hours, they picked apart my life, searching for any thread that could unravel my credibility. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, my legs were shaking, but I held my head high. They could question my methods, my motivations, even my mental health, but they couldn't change the truth buried under the Mason family home. The most devastating testimony came from the families of the victims. One by one, they shared stories of the people they had lost. A young contractor saving to start his own business, a real estate agent who had discovered discrepancies in Mason property records, a housekeeper who had worked briefly for the family before moving away suddenly. Lives interrupted, futures stolen, all to protect the Mason family's secrets and fortune. On the trial's 11th day, Michael Mason made a stunning announcement through his attorney. He wanted to testify against his parents. Unlike Eleanor's earlier attempt at a deal, Michael offered his testimony without conditions, without requests for leniency. The court buzzed with speculation as he took the stand, looking nothing like the confident, charming man I had fallen in love with. I grew up in that house, he began, his voice barely audible at first. I always knew there were parts of our home that were forbidden, questions that couldn't be asked. When I was 16, I heard noises from the basement, a woman crying, begging. When I asked my father, he said it was time for me to learn about our family legacy. Michael described how his father and grandfather had established a tradition of eliminating anyone who threatened their business interests or discovered their secrets, how they had taught him to view certain people as disposable, their lives worth less than the Mason family's prosperity and reputation. Did you participate in these murders? The prosecutor asked. Michael's eyes filled with tears. Not directly, I helped with, afterward, the financial aspects. Creating false identities to access victims, accounts, transferring funds through shell companies. I told myself I wasn't really involved because I never, his voice broke. I never actually killed anyone. But I knew, I always knew. And when Ms. Calloway began investigating these financial irregularities, my father said we needed to discredit her, that we had done it before with others who got too close. I agreed to help because I was a coward, because I was raised to protect the family above all else. Did you love Vanessa Calloway? The prosecutor asked unexpectedly. Michael looked directly at me for the first time. Yes, and I betrayed her in every way possible. Quote, the defense attorneys for Robert and Eleanor immediately moved to have Michael's testimony stricken, claiming he had been coerced or was mentally unfit. The judge denied their motion. As Michael was led from the courtroom, he stopped briefly near where I sat. I'm sorry, he whispered. It doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that. I didn't respond. There were no words adequate for the magnitude of his betrayal, for the lives destroyed by his family's monstrous sense of entitlement. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts for Robert and Eleanor Mason. For Michael, guilty of accessory after the fact and financial crimes, but not murder. As the bailiff led them away, Robert turned toward me, his face contorted with hatred. "This isn't over," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Families like mine don't stay down." A chill ran through me, but I met his gaze steadily. His threats had lost their power. The truth had finally proven stronger than the Mason family's influence. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later brought a measure of justice. Life without parole for Robert, 40 years for Eleanor, 20 for Michael. The Mason estate was seized, with proceeds from its sale established as a fund for the victims' families. The company Robert had built was dissolved, its legitimate assets redistributed, its hidden criminal enterprises exposed. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps, suddenly uncertain about what came next. For more than a year, my life had revolved around uncovering the truth about the Masons. With that chapter closed, I felt adrift. Agent Townsend found me there, watching as reporters packed up their equipment and the crowds dispersed. "You did something remarkable," he said. "Most people would have walked away when things got difficult, when their reputation was attacked, when no one believed them." "I couldn't walk away," I replied simply. "Not once I knew. That's exactly why I'm here. We have a specialized unit that investigates complex financial crimes connected to violent offenses, cold cases where money trails might lead to answers. We need someone with your skills and determination. Someone who doesn't back down when powerful people push back." I looked at him in surprise. "You're offering me a job?" "Consider it more of a calling." The Masons aren't the only wealthy family hiding horrible secrets behind respectable facades. There are more victims out there, more families waiting for answers. That evening, I visited the memorial that had spontaneously formed near the Mason estate. Photographs of the victims, flowers, candles lit in remembrance. I thought about Robert Mason's threat, about the risks of continuing to challenge powerful people with deadly secrets. Then I thought about the families who had waited decades for the truth, about how one person refusing to be silenced had finally brought them answers. The next morning, I called Agent Townsend and accepted his offer. 3 weeks later, I was training at Quantico, learning to combine my financial expertise with investigative techniques. 6 months after that, I was working my first case, a cold disappearance with suspicious banking activity surrounding a prominent political donor. The work is often dark, frequently dangerous, and always challenging. There are nights when I wake up remembering the basement under the Mason home, the hand partially buried in dirt. Days when I wonder if I'll ever fully trust anyone again after Michael's betrayal. Moments when I question whether justice can truly be achieved in a world where wealth so often shields people from consequences. But then I receive a card from the daughter of one of the Mason victims, thanking me for giving her family closure after 20 years of uncertainty. Or I trace a financial anomaly that leads to a breakthrough in a case everyone else had given up on. And I remember that sometimes, the person everyone dismisses as crazy, obsessive, or unstable is the only one willing to look where others fear to see. The Masons called me delusional, unstable, obsessed. They nearly succeeded in convincing the world, and sometimes even me, that I was losing my mind. But in the end, truth, buried under generations of wealth and privilege, finally saw the light. And if my story teaches anything, it's this: trust your instincts. Document everything. And never stop seeking the truth, even when everyone tells you you're crazy for looking. 3 years into my work with the FBI's Financial Crimes and Cold Case Unit, I found myself standing in a gleaming high-rise apartment in Chicago, staring at a wall covered in photographs, financial documents, and red string connecting seemingly unrelated points. My new life had taken me across the country, investigating cases that local authorities had abandoned or never fully understood. This particular investigation had consumed the last 7 months, 5 disappearances spanning 15 years, all connected to Blackstone Investments, a hedge fund with political connections and a squeaky clean public image. "You've got that look again," my partner, Special Agent Devin Reynolds, said as he entered with 2 cups of coffee. "The one that says you're seeing something the rest of us are missing." I accepted the coffee without taking my eyes off the wall. The pattern changed with victim 3. The first 2 disappearances were opportunistic, people who accidentally discovered something they shouldn't have. But starting with Gary Phillips, they became strategic eliminations. Meaning? Meaning, someone at Blackstone realized they could use their existing system for handling problems to actually advance their interests. Phillips wasn't a threat. He was a competitor whose removal benefited them financially. Devon studied the wall. That's a significant escalation. From defensive to offensive. Exactly. And it suggests something else. Whoever's behind this isn't just protecting themselves anymore. They're enjoying it. This was my life now. Piecing together financial breadcrumbs that led to dark conclusions, tracking money that moved like smoke through shell companies and offshore accounts, all to conceal the most horrific crimes imaginable. The work was demanding, often isolating, but it gave purpose to the trauma I'd experienced with the Masons. Every case solved was another family granted the closure I'd helped provide to the Mason victims' loved ones. My phone vibrated with a text from the assistant director. Mason parole hearing scheduled, details in your email. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. Michael Mason had served 5 years of his 20-year sentence, becoming eligible for his first parole hearing due to good behavior and his cooperation in other investigations. While Robert and Eleanor would remain imprisoned for life, Michael had the possibility of early release. Bad news? Devon asked, noting my expression. Just ghost from the past, I replied, tucking my phone away. Let's focus on Blackstone. I want to follow that transfer from the Cayman account to Switzerland. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Later that evening, alone in my hotel room, I opened the email about Michael's parole hearing. As the primary witness in the case, I was being notified of my right to provide a victim impact statement. The hearing was scheduled for the following month in New Hampshire, where Michael had been serving his sentence in a medium-security federal prison. I hadn't seen Michael since his sentencing, 5 years earlier. Sometimes I caught glimpses of him in dreams. Not the monster he had revealed himself to be, but the man I thought I knew, the man I had loved. Those dreams always left me disoriented, angry at my subconscious for its betrayal. For weeks, I deliberated about whether to attend the hearing. The Blackstone case demanded my attention, and revisiting the Mason nightmare meant reopening wounds that had never fully healed. But as the date approached, I realized I needed closure, not just for the victims, but for myself. I can come with you, Devon offered when I finally shared my decision. As backup. I appreciate that, but this is something I need to face alone, I told him. Besides, someone needs to keep digging into Blackstone's European connections. The prison was surrounded by rolling green hills that belied the darkness contained within its walls. I passed through security, surrendered my phone, and was escorted to the hearing room by a corrections officer who recognized my name. You're the one who caught the Masons, he said, respect evident in his voice. That case is taught at the academy now, you know. How financial forensics can break open cold cases. I managed a small smile, uncomfortable with being recognized. Inside the hearing room, I took a seat at the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous until called to speak. Other attendees filed in, representatives from the victims, families, the prosecutor who had handled the case, a few journalists permitted to cover the hearing. And then Michael entered, escorted by guards. 5 years had changed him profoundly. The polished, confident man I had known was gone, replaced by someone thinner, paler, with premature gray threading through his dark hair. He scanned the room as he entered, his eyes finding mine immediately, as if he had sensed my presence. For a moment, neither of us looked away. Then he was seated, facing the parole board, his back to the audience. The hearing proceeded methodically. Michael's prison record was reviewed, model behavior, participation in therapy programs, work tutoring other inmates. The prosecutor spoke about the severity of his crimes, emphasizing that while Michael hadn't directly murdered anyone, his complicity had enabled his family's decades-long killing spree. Representatives from the victims, families spoke next, their pain still raw after all these years. Some opposed Michael's parole vehemently. Others acknowledged his cooperation had helped bring his parents to justice. One woman, the daughter of an early victim, spoke directly to Michael. "You were raised in evil," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You participated in evil. But unlike your parents, you eventually chose truth. That has to count for something in this world." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When my turn came, I walked to the podium, aware of Michael's eyes following me. The parole board members regarded me with interest. The woman who had unraveled the Mason family's secrets was something of a legend in law enforcement circles. Ms. Calloway, the head of the board, greeted me. "Your insights would be particularly valuable to this panel, given your unique perspective on both the case and the defendant." I had prepared remarks, carefully written and revised over several sleepless nights, but standing there, I set aside my notes. 5 years ago, I discovered that the man I loved came from a family of murderers. I began. That he had actively participated in covering up their crimes, in stealing from their victims, in maintaining the facade that allowed them to continue killing. The betrayal was... I paused, searching for words adequate to the experience. Total. It destroyed my faith not just in him, but in my own judgment. I glanced at Michael, who was watching me intently. "But I'm not here to talk about my pain. I'm here because 10 people lost their lives. 10 families spent years or decades wondering what happened to someone they loved. Those victims deserve justice. Their families deserve peace. And society deserves protection from those who view human life as disposable." The room was silent, waiting. Michael Mason was raised in a household where murder was treated as a family tradition, where certain people were considered acceptable sacrifices to maintain wealth and status. That upbringing doesn't excuse his actions, but it does provide context. And unlike his parents, when finally confronted with the truth, he chose to acknowledge it. His testimony ensured Robert and Eleanor Mason will never harm anyone else. I took a deep breath. I cannot forgive what Michael did, the role he played in his family's crimes, the way he betrayed my trust and tried to destroy my credibility when I got too close to the truth. But I also recognize that people can change, that even those raised in darkness can eventually choose light. Looking directly at the parole board, I continued. "If you decide to grant Michael Mason parole, I won't oppose that decision, but I urge you to ensure that strict conditions are attached. Ongoing therapy, regular monitoring, and a prohibition against accessing the wealth his family accumulated through their crimes. Most importantly, I ask that you consider the message your decision sends to others who might be in Michael's position, people who know about ongoing crimes but remain silent out of loyalty or fear." As I returned to my seat, Michael turned to watch me, his expression unreadable. The remainder of the hearing passed in a blur. When it concluded, the board announced they would deliberate and deliver their decision within a week. As people filed out, I lingered, uncertain why I couldn't simply leave. Michael approached, accompanied by a guard. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not opposing my parole. I didn't expect that." "I didn't do it for you," I replied. "I did it because continuing the cycle of punishment doesn't bring back the dead. Because holding on to hatred only hurts me, not you or your parents." He nodded, accepting this. "I've thought about you every day. About how to make amends, knowing that's impossible." "It is impossible," I agreed. "Some things can't be undone, Michael. Some betrayals can't be forgiven." "I know." He hesitated. "But I want you to know that meeting you, loving you, it changed me. You were the first person who made me question everything I'd been taught, who made me see that what my family did was monstrous, not necessary." "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't romanticize what happened between us. Don't pretend our relationship was some redemptive turning point. You watched me being destroyed by your family and did nothing until you were caught." Pain flickered across his face. "You're right. I'm sorry. A guard indicated it was time for Michael to return to his cell. As he turned to leave, I found myself asking the question that had haunted me for years. Was any of it real? Between us? He looked back. All of it. That's the worst part. I loved you completely, and I betrayed you anyway, because that's who I was raised to be. The guard led him away, and I watched until he disappeared through a secure door. Outside, I sat in my rental car for a long time, unable to drive, overwhelmed by emotions I'd suppressed for years. Grief for the relationship I'd lost, anger at the betrayal, relief at finally confronting Michael directly. And underneath it all, a strange, unwelcome compassion for the child he had been, raised by monsters to become a monster himself, yet somehow finding the courage to eventually choose differently. My phone rang. Devin checking in. How did it go? It went, I said, starting the car. Listen, I've been thinking about the Blackstone case. The transfer patterns suggest someone at the executive level is directing the operation, but the actual disappearances are being handled by an outside specialist. You're working, now? Devin sounded concerned. It helps me process, I admitted, and I think I know how to identify the specialist. The financial forensics point to someone with military background making regular cash withdrawals in the same cities where the disappearances occurred. Vanessa, Devin said gently, come back to Chicago. Take a day off. Process what happened at the hearing before diving back into another dark case. I knew he was right, but the work had become my anchor, my way of transforming my own trauma into purpose. I'll fly back tomorrow, but tonight, I need to follow this lead. A week later, the parole board's decision arrived via email. Michael Mason was granted conditional release with strict monitoring requirements, mandatory continued therapy, and a prohibition against accessing family assets. He would be released in 30 days. I absorbed this news while working late in our Chicago office, the Blackstone investigation now progressing rapidly. We had identified the specialist, a former military contractor named James Mercer, who had connections to Blackstone's CEO, Victor Harmon. Financial records showed regular payments through elaborate channels designed to obscure their source and destination. We've got enough for surveillance warrants, Devin announced, dropping a stack of papers on my desk. Judge Carlin signed off an hour ago. That's faster than expected, I noted. Apparently, your reputation preceded us. When I mentioned you were leading the financial investigation, she fast-tracked the approval. Within days, we had surveillance teams monitoring both Mercer and key Blackstone executives. The breakthrough came when Mercer was observed meeting Victor Harmon at an exclusive club after hours, exchanging what appeared to be documents. Our team intercepted Mercer afterward, finding detailed information about a potential whistleblower within Blackstone, an accountant named Elise Chen, who had noticed discrepancies in certain investment accounts. This is it, I told the assistant director as we assembled a protection team for Chen. The same pattern as the Mason cases. Someone discovers financial irregularities, and instead of risking exposure, they eliminate the threat. Within 48 hours, Mercer was in custody, and raids on multiple Blackstone offices yielded evidence connecting Harmon directly to 3 of the 5 disappearances. Elise Chen was placed under protection, her testimony crucial to building the case against Harmon and other Blackstone executives. As the case unfolded in the media, I received a letter forwarded through the FBI office. The return address was a halfway house in New Hampshire. Michael's handwriting. For days, I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, both drawn to and repelled by whatever message he might have sent. Finally, late one night after reviewing evidence for the Blackstone prosecution, I opened it. Vanessa, it began. I've been following the Blackstone case in the news. Your work there reminds me of how we met. You noticing financial details others missed, following them to their darkest conclusions. I hope you found purpose in that work, turning what happened with my family into something meaningful. I won't ask for forgiveness I don't deserve, but I want you to know that your testimony at my parole hearing affected me deeply. The fact that you could see both the monster I was and the possibility of change. It gives me hope that others might eventually see that too. I'm working with an organization that helps children from abusive homes, trying to break cycles of violence before they become intergenerational like in my family. It feels like the only meaningful way to use whatever time I have left. You asked if what we had was real. It was the only real thing in my life of pretense and secrets. I will always regret that I wasn't brave enough to choose you over the family legacy sooner. I won't contact you again. You deserve to move forward without ghosts from the past haunting you. But know that you changed at least one life for the better, even in the midst of all the darkness you uncovered. Michael. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not discarded, not prominently displayed, simply acknowledged and set aside, like the chapter of my life it represented. The Blackstone case concluded with 7 indictments, including Victor Harmon and 3 other executives. James Mercer cooperated, leading investigators to remains of all 5 victims. As in the Mason case, the Blackstone crimes had begun as pragmatic eliminations of threats, but evolved into something more deliberate, more sadistic. Wealth and power creating a sense of godlike impunity that corrupted absolutely. At the press conference following the arrests, a reporter asked about parallels to the Mason case that had launched my career. Both cases involve powerful people who believed their wealth placed them above consequences. I acknowledged. Who viewed certain lives as disposable obstacles to their ambitions. But there's a crucial difference. The Masons operated in isolation, a family protecting their secrets. Blackstone represents something more insidious. Institutional power enabling individual criminality. Do you see these cases as exceptional or representative of a broader pattern? Another reporter asked. I considered the question carefully. I've investigated dozens of cases connecting financial crimes to violence. What I've found is that while most wealthy people and institutions operate within ethical and legal boundaries, there exists a small subset who come to believe that their privilege exempts them from basic human morality. When that belief goes unchallenged, when money can buy silence and influence, the potential for evil expands exponentially. Later that evening, I met Devin and other team members to celebrate the successful conclusion of the case. As we shared drinks and relief at bringing another group of killers to justice, my phone buzzed with a notification, a new case referral from the assistant director. Seriously? We just closed Blackstone today, Devin protested, seeing me check the message. It's just preliminary information, I said, skimming the details. Financial anomalies surrounding disappearances in Seattle. 3 victims over 7 years, all connected to a tech conglomerate. It never ends, does it? Devin sighed. No, I agreed. But that's why we do this work. Because someone has to say, no more. Someone has to ensure that wealth and power don't equal impunity. As I looked around at my colleagues, dedicated, compassionate people who had become something like family over the years, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive since the Mason case. I had transformed my trauma into purpose, my victimization into strength. The work was often dark, frequently heartbreaking, but it mattered. It restored balance to a world where money too often tipped the scales of justice. 6 months later, I stood at a memorial service for the Blackstone victims, watching as families finally laid their loved ones to rest with dignity and truth. A woman approached me afterward. Elise Chen, the whistleblower whose life we had potentially saved by interrupting Blackstone's plans. I wanted to thank you, she said, not just for protecting me, but for believing me when I said something felt wrong with those accounts. Most people would have dismissed my concerns. I know what it's like to be dismissed, I told her. To be called crazy for noticing what others don't want to see. How do you do it? She asked. Face this kind of darkness day after day? I thought about Michael's letter, about the Masons, about all the cases I'd investigated since. About the victims whose stories might never have been told if someone hadn't been willing to follow financial breadcrumbs to difficult truths. I do it because I can, I said simply, because having seen what happens when evil goes unchecked, I can't unsee it. And because every time we expose these crimes, we make it a little harder for the next person who thinks their money puts them beyond justice. As Elise walked away, I noticed a familiar figure standing beneath a distant tree. Agent Townsend, now approaching retirement, the man who had first recognized my potential and guided me into this work. Another case closed. he said as I joined him. Another group of families with answers they deserved. It doesn't feel like enough, I admitted. There are always more cases. More victims. That's true, he acknowledged. But consider this. The Vanessa Calloway who stood alone against the Mason family now leads a specialized FBI unit. The methods you developed have been adopted by law enforcement agencies nationwide. The patterns you identified have helped solve dozens of cold cases. One person can't fix everything, but one person can start a movement that changes the system. I smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. The scared, isolated woman who had discovered bodies beneath the Victorian mansion had transformed not just her own life, but the way financial crimes connected to violence were investigated throughout the country. That night, I added a new photograph to my apartment wall. Not case evidence, but something personal. A group picture of my FBI team, all of us tired but triumphant after the Blackstone arrests. Beside it, I placed a small news clipping about a program helping children escape cycles of abuse, the organization Michael now worked with. Not because I had forgiven or forgotten, but because every story of transformation mattered in the larger battle against darkness. The family that had called me crazy, tried to destroy me, and nearly succeeded, had instead catalyzed a purpose larger than myself. Their attempt to silence one voice had ultimately amplified many voices, those of victims long silenced, whistleblowers brave enough to speak truth to power, and investigators willing to follow evidence wherever it led. Sometimes being called crazy is the price of seeing clearly in a world determined to look away from uncomfortable truths. Sometimes being ostracized is the cost of standing firm when others falter. And sometimes, the person everyone dismisses as unstable or obsessive becomes the catalyst for justice that ripples outward, touching lives they'll never even know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.